Pick up every dollar you threw at her feet. Ricky laughed mid-bite, like the man across the table had made a joke nobody else heard yet. Dee Carter froze on her knees beside the table, 3 crumpled bills pinched between her fingers, her tray balanced against her hip, her whole body very still. The private dining room of the Gilded Stag had gone quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the candlelight or the low jazz piping through the speakers. Theo Bianchi was still grinning, phone tilted toward her like she was content. Ricky hadn't stopped smiling either. Neither of them had noticed that the man at the head of the table had set his glass down. For a moment, no one moved. Not the busboy frozen in the doorway with a tray of bread. Not the 2 men flanking the entrance who hadn't said a word all night, but suddenly looked like they were watching a different scene entirely. Not Dee, who had learned a long time ago that the safest thing a black woman in a server's apron could do in a room full of money was stay small, stay quiet, get through the shift. She kept her eyes on the floor. She did not yet understand that the most dangerous man in that room had just decided, in total silence, that tonight was the night that stopped working for everyone but her. Nobody at that table knew his name was Salvatore Moretti. Nobody understood yet what it meant that he'd been watching this unfold for the last 11 minutes without saying a single word. And nobody, least of all Ricky, still laughing, still filming, had any idea that in about 90 seconds, 2 words from that man were going to end more than just a dinner. If you've ever been humiliated in front of someone who could have stopped it and didn't say anything yet, wait for what happens next, and subscribe so you don't miss how this one ends. Dee's hands trembled around the crumpled bills, but she didn't drop her tray. Years of double shifts had taught her that the body could shake and still keep working. This humiliation had a rhythm you learned to move through without spilling a single glass. She kept her eyes down, not because she agreed with what was happening, but because looking up cost more than she could afford to lose. Around the table, the other diners, 2 junior partners from a separate party, a woman in a green dress who'd been laughing loudly 20 minutes earlier, had gone suddenly very interested in their plates. Nobody said a word. Nobody ever did. Ricky leaned back in his chair, satisfied, phone still angled toward her like he was capturing content for later. "See," he said to Theo, "this is why I love this place. Service with a smile, no matter what." Theo laughed too loud, the kind of laugh that needed an audience to mean anything. Neither of them looked at the head of the table, where Salvatore Moretti sat with his hands folded now, watching Dee with an attention that had nothing performative in it. He hadn't touched his drink in 11 minutes. He hadn't said a word since the appetizers were cleared. The manager, Wendell, stood near the kitchen doors, and if Dee had looked up, she would have seen his face had gone the color of the tablecloths. Wendell knew exactly who Salvatore Moretti was. He'd spent the entire dinner praying this room stayed quiet, and instead he was watching it unravel in real time over a handful of dollar bills and a server who was never even supposed to be working this section tonight. Ricky snapped his fingers at her, the way you'd call a dog back to heel. "Chop, chop. Some of us have somewhere to be." Theo snorted into his glass. That was when Salvatore Moretti finally moved. Not fast, not loud. He simply reached forward and set his glass down on the white tablecloth with a small, deliberate click that somehow cut through every other sound in the room. "Don't move," he said, 2 words, quiet enough that Theo almost missed them. But Dee heard them, and so did Wendell, whose hand flew instinctively to the back of a chair to steady himself, because he understood something the Bianchi boys clearly did not, that nobody in that room had any real idea who they'd just spent the last 20 minutes performing for. 6 hours earlier, Dee Carter had no idea any of this was coming. The Chicago sky was still doing its slow orange fade into evening when she clocked in at the Gilded Stag, feet already aching from a morning shift at the diner 3 blocks over. The kind of double she'd been pulling twice a week since her sister died and left behind 2 kids who needed groceries, school shoes, and someone steady to come home to. Dee had been that someone for 3 years now. She didn't complain about it. She just showed up. She wasn't even supposed to be working the private dining room that night. That section belonged to Marisol, who had called in sick an hour before service, and Wendell, never one to miss a chance to remind staff of their place, had looked Dee up and down before assigning it to her, the way he always did, like he was deciding whether she'd embarrass the restaurant or not. Big party in the back room tonight, he told her, not quite meeting her eyes. Important people. Just keep your head down and keep the drinks coming. He didn't tell her who. He never did. Dee tied her apron tighter and pinned a photo of her sister to the inside of her locker, the way she did every shift. A small ritual nobody else knew about. A reminder of why her feet kept moving, even when they didn't want to. In the break room mirror, she looked tired in the particular way that didn't show up on a time card, the kind of tired that lived behind the eyes. She told herself it was just another shift. 6 hours, good tips if she was lucky, home by midnight to relieve her neighbor who watched the kids. What she didn't know was that the backroom booking wasn't really a celebration dinner. It was a negotiation, a contractor pitch from the Bianchi family's construction outfit, the kind of meeting where careers and contracts got decided over steak and bourbon, and where the quiet man at the head of the table held more weight than anyone else in the building combined. Wendell knew exactly who that man was. He'd spent all afternoon rearranging the entire backroom layout just to make sure nothing went wrong. Whatever happens in that room tonight, Wendell told the staff before service began, voice low, eyes darting toward the kitchen doors, you didn't see it. Understand? Nobody asked him why. Nobody ever did with Wendell. Dee just nodded, picked up her tray, and walked into a room she had no way of knowing would change her entire life by the time the entrees were cleared. If you've ever been underestimated by people who had no idea who was actually watching, comment your name and city below. You're going to want to see exactly how this plays out. The dinner started the way these dinners always did, with too much bourbon and too many compliments aimed at a man who didn't seem to need them. Ricky and Theo Bianchi had come prepared, a leather folder of site plans between them, talking over each other about timelines and union costs, trying to land a contract that would put their family's name on 3 new developments along the lakefront. Salvatore Moretti listened the way he did everything else, without giving much away. He nodded occasionally. He asked short questions that made the brothers scramble for answers they didn't quite have. He never once raised his voice, and somehow that made the boys talk louder, filled a silence with bravado, the way men do when they mistake quiet for weakness. Dee moved through the room the way she'd trained herself to, refilling glasses, clearing plates, present but invisible, exactly the way Wendell wanted her. She caught fragments of the conversation without meaning to. Numbers, deadlines, the word partnership, repeated so many times it started to sound desperate. She didn't know what any of it meant for her own night, only that the man at the head of the table tipped his head slightly every time she came near, like he was tracking the room without looking like he was tracking anything. It started small. Ricky made a comment about her wasting a chair when she paused to steady a tray. Theo laughed and added something about hoping the kitchen wasn't running low on portions, nodding toward her with a grin he clearly thought was charming. Dee said nothing. She built a wall a long time ago, brick by brick, out of moments exactly like this one, and she knew the fastest way through them was silence and a steady hand. Inside, though, something pulled tight every time. The old, familiar arithmetic of pride against rent, of what she wanted to say against what she could afford to lose. Salvatore Moretti watched all of it. At one point, he leaned toward Wendell, who'd come to check on the table, and asked quietly for her name. Wendell told him, Carter, D. Carter. Sal repeated, slow, like he was filing it away somewhere permanent. He wrote nothing down. The comments kept climbing. Ricky pulled out his phone, angled it toward Dee as she poured water, narrating to an imaginary audience like she was content for him to perform with. Theo, emboldened, turned to Sal directly. "You good with the help tonight, Sal? Or you want someone a little easier on the eyes next time?" He said it loud enough for the whole table to hear, loud enough that even the woman in the green dress 2 tables over flinched. Sal said nothing. Not yet. He simply watched Dee's face, the way she absorbed the comment without letting it show, the practiced stillness of someone who had survived 1,000 small cruelties, exactly like this one, and learned not to let any of them land where people could see. Then, Ricky, deciding the night needed one more laugh, pulled a handful of crumpled bills from his pocket and flung them toward her feet. "Earn it," he said, grinning at Theo for approval. Dee looked down at the money scattered across the floor, looked up once, briefly, at the silent man at the head of the table, and knelt down to gather it, because that was what 20 years of survival had trained her to do. That was the exact moment Salvatore Moretti set his glass down. Salvatore Moretti stood. It was the first time all night he'd moved from that chair, and the simple act of it seemed to drain every other sound out of the room. The clink of silverware, the low jazz overhead, even Ricky's half-finished laugh died somewhere in his throat. Sal was not a large man in the way Ricky and Theo were large, all gym muscle and expensive watches. He was something quieter and far more unsettling, the kind of presence that made a room recalculate itself without anyone telling it to. He didn't look at Ricky right away. He looked at the money scattered across the floor, and then at Dee, still kneeling, bills pinched between her fingers, frozen mid-motion, like she'd been caught somewhere she didn't choose to be. Then his eyes moved to Ricky, and his voice came out level, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse than shouting ever could have. "Pick it up," he said. Ricky blinked, glanced at Theo for backup, found a laugh instead of an answer. "What?" "Every dollar," Sal said, "by hand. You threw it, you pick it up." Dee, still kneeling, felt the air shift in a way she didn't fully understand yet. She started to rise, started to wave it off the way she always did, the instinct to smooth things over so deeply trained into her, it happened before she could stop it. "Sir, it's fine. Really, I don't need." Sal turned toward her for the first time all night, fully, and something in his expression made the rest of the room disappear. "It's not about what you need," he said quietly. "It's about what kind of men I let sit at my table." The words landed differently than anything that had been said all evening. This wasn't about her dignity being defended out of kindness. This was a man drawing a line about his own house, his own name, the company he kept, and Dee just happened to be standing in the exact spot where that line had finally been drawn. Wendell, still frozen by the kitchen doors, looked like he might be sick. Ricky, still not understanding the size of the hole he was standing in, let out a short, disbelieving laugh and muttered to Theo, low but not low enough, "Man's gone soft over a waitress." He said it like a joke. He said it like the kind of thing that wouldn't matter in 5 minutes. The temperature in the room dropped to something close to 0. Sal didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He simply turned his full attention onto Ricky for the first time all night. And in that silence, something passed across his face that made even Theo go still beside his brother. The unmistakable look of a man who had just decided, completely and permanently, that this contract, this meeting, and possibly far more than that, was already over. Sal didn't raise his voice, not even now. He simply looked at the folder of site plans still sitting untouched at the center of the table and slid it back toward Ricky with 2 fingers, like it was something he no longer wanted near him. "The contract's dead," he said. "Don't bother calling my office. And by Monday, every site foreman in this city is going to know exactly why." Ricky's face went pale in a way no amount of cologne or tailored suits could disguise. Theo opened his mouth to argue and found nothing worth saying. Sal reached into his jacket, pulled out a money clip, and peeled off bills, not as payment, not as charity, but with the deliberate weight of a man settling a debt he considered overdue. He pressed them into Dee's hand himself, more than her entire night's tips combined, and didn't wait for thanks. Then he turned to Wendell, who was still rooted by the kitchen doors, looking like a man watching his restaurant's reputation hang in the balance. "Is she the best server you have?" Sal asked, flat. No room for flattery in the question. Wendell swallowed. Yes, sir, she is." "Then she works whatever room I'm in from now on, every time." It wasn't a request, and everyone at that table understood the difference. The Bianchi brothers gathered their folder and their coats in a silence heavier than anything they'd walked in with. The same room that had laughed at their jokes 20 minutes earlier, now watching them leave like men who just discovered the floor wasn't as solid as they'd thought. Nobody spoke as they passed Dee on their way out. Nobody needed to. The humiliation they'd handed her over crumpled dollar bills had found its way back to them in full, and this time there was no audience left to laugh along. The room emptied slowly, and only once the last of the Bianchi party had gone did Dee finally let her hands shake the way they'd wanted to all night. She wasn't looking for gratitude, and she didn't perform any. She just stood there, money still clutched in her fist, feeling the strange weight of the night that had nearly broken her, and instead had turned itself completely inside out. Sal lingered by the door a moment longer than he needed to, jacket already half on. "I don't do this for show," he told her, voice quieter now than it had been all evening. "My mother waited tables for 30 years. Nobody ever stood up for her either." It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't a kindness performed for an audience. It was the simplest explanation he had, the one true thing underneath everything that had just happened in that room. Dee nodded, throat tight, and said the only thing that felt honest. "Thank you for seeing me." Sal didn't answer that, just held her gaze a moment, then walked out into the Chicago night without another word. Dee Carter had spent most of her life being looked past by managers, by men with money, by a world that decided early on what kind of attention she deserved. It took one man's silence, not his wealth, to make sure that stopped being true. She untied her apron, pinned the night's earnings safely in her pocket, and walked out, knowing tomorrow would look different, even if she couldn't yet say exactly how. If this story moved you, subscribe for more justice stories where dignity wins. Comment below, would you have spoken up like Dee, or stayed quiet to keep the job?